Welcome back for another book talk video. Today I'm talking about fantasy because it's Magical Monday, and I want you to know about Jack Vance. He is the author of The Dying Earth. Jack Vance is one of those authors who has won both the Hugo Award and the Nebula Award, which is so impressive when you think about the history of science fiction and fantasy and how those authors are respected. Unfortunately, we live in a world in which a lot of people, even people who read a ton of fantasy, often don't seem to know who Jack Vance is. And maybe that's because he was publishing books back in the 1950s and 60s. I mean, it's been a while. It was a long time ago, but I really enjoy his writing. I think that in some of his passages, it reminds me of Lewis Carroll. But this is a serious story. Actually, the Dying Earth series is quite nihilistic, and it's got some very selfish, evil, arrogant, and unlikable characters, along with a couple of characters that you might like and identify with more than the bad ones. Also, the book, The Dying Earth, stands out to me as one of those books that might challenge your definition of a novel. Because while this book is called a novel, I would ask you to question whether or not it is. And that's because it was originally published in 1950, and there were different standards and ideas in somewhat of how publishing used terminology those days. Really, The Dying Earth, as a book, is a collection of 6 stories that come together as being interconnected. They take place on the Dying Earth. They have a setting that links them together. There are some characters involved in multiple stories so that it comes together as a whole. But what's really funny is I didn't know that when I was reading this book. There I go, getting all excited about reading a book and not doing my research. So I want to tell you more about this book, but I also want to give you the info that this video is going to be in 2 parts from here on. First, I will tell you about the book and the setting and the characters and all that. Then I'm going to talk about how this book is a part of Appendix and how it inspired Gary Gygax for tabletop gaming, Dungeons and Dragons, all that. That way, if you don't really care about tabletop gaming, you can just listen to the part about the plot and setting and characters and themes, and you don't have to listen to the last part of the video if you don't want to. But I hope you stick around. So in these 6 stories, we get Tertian of Mir, we get Mazirian the Magician, we get Tessias, we get Lane the Wayfarer, we get Ulan Dor, and we get Guile of Steer. And I don't know if I'm pronouncing all of that correctly, because these are fantasy names that were created around 1950. I mentioned that this book challenges the concept of a novel. It actually has won awards and been on lists. One of those lists was an all-time best fantasy novels list that Locust put together in 1987, which was determined by a poll from their subscribers, so take that for what you will. If you're willing to read a book or a novel or a quasi-novel that is really a collection of stories that connect to each other, I think you should just know that going in so that you don't get confused like I did when I read it. One of the confusing elements is that throughout these 6 stories, there's a woman who is very disagreeable, and that's because she's really a construct. She's been created by this man, and there was some sort of issue to where her brain is messed up and she's just very contrarian. She hates everything and she's very upset with the world. And by the way, to me this comes across as part of the nihilistic theme that's going on in the book. And then you find out there's another woman who looks just like her who doesn't have those issues. And that's part of what was confusing to me when I read the book. So I want to make sure you know, before you read The Dying Earth by Jack Vance, those are 2 different women, and they have different personalities and identities. They just look identical. And do you think that's going to end up being part of the story? Of course it is. You're just probably like me, you're going to be rooting for the nice woman who doesn't want to kill all the animals and destroy everything. So you're probably going to hope that the nicer version of this construct or person wins out in the end. That is a big part of the story. You also probably will be rooting for the character Tertian in the story. He comes across, out of all the wizards that are involved, he comes across as the nicest guy from the different wizards. And there are several just evil, selfish selfish, power-hungry wizards. One of the reasons for that, one of the reasons these characters tend to be so negative in the story is because the dying Earth, the title of the book and of the series, is meant to be literal. These stories are set in the far future when the Earth is dying because the sun is dying out. And the characters will make references. They know that the Earth is dying. They see what's happened to the human population, though it's never really specified how much time is left. Maybe they don't know exactly how much time is left, but they know the Earth is dying, and there's not a whole lot of good stuff left for them. It's at a point in the future to where science and magic have joined together and become one. It's a point at the future in which a lot of knowledge has been lost, and that allows for a lot of fun, fantasy, magical stuff to be happening. I hope that's enough to get you interested in the story and to get you thinking that, yeah, you should read this classic fantasy. So now let me talk about how this book inspired Gary Gygax with the creation of Dungeons and Dragons. If you're at all familiar with D&D, you might have heard at some point the term Vancian magic. They gave Jack Vance credit for inspiring the magic system, which used to be used in D&D. The latest edition is the 5th edition of D&D, and it's actually different now. But if you played old school D&D, 2nd edition, 3rd edition, then you were using the Vancian magic system. And that is what happens in this book. Wizards have to study books for their spells. And in those books, they memorize what are like math formulas in order to make the magic work. They can only hold so many of these spell formulas in their head at a time. Otherwise, I guess it would drive them insane or they would forget them. And so they are limited with how much magic, how many spells that they can cast per day, or before they have to go back and study their books and memorize spells again. They have to memorize specific spells, and they have to memorize it the number of times they want to cast it. And so that became an integral part of how the game Dungeons and Dragons worked. That's how wizards worked. They had to learn these spells and memorize them and prepare them, predict what they were going to need in the future, and just have those spells in their head and be ready to use them. Now D&D is a lot friendlier in the rules, and you don't just lose the spell when you cast it. This latest edition of D&D isn't exactly Vancian magic anymore because it makes it easier for the players. It also makes it easier for the record keeping and helps the game to go by faster. But the original concepts are what are in this book. So if you read this book, don't say, oh, it felt very much like D&D and how they were just casting the spells from the book, because this is pre-D&D. D&D stole from this, and I think it works really well. I think the magic makes sense, and it's used well by the characters and in the world building. This book also establishes the entire series. There are 4 main books, though I was surprised when I looked on Goodreads. Apparently there's a book credited as 2.5, which I haven't read yet. So book 1 is The Dying Earth, what I've been talking about. Book 2 is The Eyes of the Overworld, and that's where it gets a lot more like Lewis Carroll with the language. It was a lot of fun in that one. Apparently book 2.5 is A Quest for Symbillus. Book 3 is Cudgel Saga. Book 4 is Rialto the Marvelous. Several years ago, I hunted down old paperback copies of all these books, but you don't have to do that. You can actually buy them in a collection, books 1 through 4, called Tales of the Dying Earth. That would probably save you some money. You get all 4 of them at once in the collection, and you wouldn't have to buy as many used books and pay as much shipping or have as much trouble finding each one of them along the way. It can be expensive studying Appendix N when you try and get all the books from the author if you're trying to own old physical copies of the books. Alright, that's it for my book talk. I've gone over time again, haven't I? But it's exciting talking about these fantasy novels. I hope I've caused you to at least consider checking out Jack Vance and the Vancian magic system. Oh, before I go, I would be remiss if I didn't point out that Gary Gygax also named the horrible villain in D&D, Vecna, after Vance. He just moved the letters around, which is a fun thing to do. The Eye of Vecna, the Hand of Vecna. If you ever encounter them, say no. Run away. You don't want to have anything to do with them in any adventures. That's it for today's book talk. Every day is a good day for a book talk. Peace.